Hi, Greg, and welcome. It's really nice to see you back. It had been a while, and I thought it'd be nice to kind of do a small catch up of and the news and the overview with what's new in your world, nutrition, and what you're working on.
Yes, good to see you too. Good to see you too. It's been exciting for me. Of course, I keep getting new books and reading, watching podcasts, and I signed up to go to a conference in Salt Lake City in a few weeks. So that's going to be interesting, seeing a number of speakers there. I'll put a link to information on that.
Yeah,
And my paper from the Goodman Institute was released just a couple weeks ago. Uh,
congratulations.
yeah. It was fun. It was fun to work on last fall and go through the editing process. The title is Did the Government Make Us Fat? It's their brief analysis number 142. And they also highlighted it on their first quarter report to supporters and friends of the Goodman Institute. So I hope to do more with them. And I look forward to some of the feedback we get from that.
That's really exciting, actually, when we were talking back and forth, and I was talking a little bit low carb and thyroid and how this affects women. You sent me some links, and one of them was Chris Krasser, I think. Sorry, here I'm really bad with names, and I was so excited to listen all his podcast because I really identify with the problems and everything what he's dealing with and he's tackling. So yeah, thank you so much for that. As mentioning, we wanted to know a little bit more what's new in the world of nutrition and public health. As you mentioned that you actually did your brief analysis of the Goodman Institute. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's a common theme to the research by the various peer review. I mean, what I tried to do is not just give my opinion, but to draw from peer-reviewed research. And one of the most recent studies I thought was interesting was sort of separate from the low fat, low carb, protein debates over, what to eat most of, and separately looked at the energy balance theory of obesity. So for 50 years, the theory has been that people get heavy simply because of an energy imbalance. And if they just eat a little less and exercise a little more, they'd lose weight. It's thermodynamics. There's TED Talks on this with a guy with test tubes and pouring things here and there, with the idea that this obesity epidemic in the US and Canada, not far behind, in Western Europe, is just energy imbalance. Maybe we're not walking enough, we're not working in the fields, we're working in offices, and we just need to eat less. But the research on this theory was presented years ago, and it was contra to the understanding before that, even in the textbooks, that for people that are heavy, obese, or whatever, you just eat less carbohydrates, right? You eat less starchy food. And that was the Banting diet from the 40s and 50s. Earlier French researchers and others just said obesity is linked to, if you want to deal with losing weight, you eat less carbs. So more research on this, now that we know how much more can measure our blood glucose levels with blood glucose sticks and other things. We know that for a lot of people, when they eat carbohydrates, they're somehow intolerant, that their blood glucose shoots up, and over years of too much carbohydrates, they become insulin resistant. So the point is, these guys say obesity is an issue of hormonal imbalance caused by insulin resistance, and the best way to address it is to just eat less carbohydrates. Now, that's not saying you have to eliminate all carbohydrates, as the carnivores or keto people say, although you can, and there's advocates for that. But what the federal government did is push carbohydrate recommendations up to 50, 60, 70% because they were promoting the idea that you have to reduce fat in the diet. So the argument is that's caused the obesity epidemic, is the shift to carbohydrates from healthy fats that were part of an American diet.
Right. And I also assume it's a little bit related to pricing, right? Because if we're having, I'm not sure about the pricing in United States, but for example, here in Canada, avocados that have and are healthy fats are really expensive. Meanwhile, if you take a croissant or a bread, it's way cheaper, right? So I assume it's also more effective for the government and beneficial, and cheaper for people to kind of go with high carbs without them realizing that they're actually adding that to their diet, and it's not good for them on a long term, as you just explained, right?
Well, yeah, there are certainly cost issues. It's fun looking at the history of avocados because most people didn't eat an avocado, and the avocado industry for decades tried to promote them, and people thought, "Yuck, what is this gooey, gooey stuff?" But then it becomes very popular with guacamole and all that stuff. But the food issue aside, there is an issue of cost, which is shelf life. So Peter Attia has a nice video on this. You know, what can you produce at low cost from inexpensive, you know, corn or soy, whatever, and how do you set it so the shelf life can be weeks or months in a grocery store? Because a big problem for a lot of people, you get fresh food and then it goes bad. It's a battle to eat it before it goes bad. But with stabilized food, long lasting, but a lot of that is high carb. But separate from this, though, is the government push to say, look, you've got to cut saturated fats. They believe saturated fats caused heart disease. And this was the Ansel Keys theory promoted by the McGovern Commission. And that led to the whole push for the food pyramid. This is taught in every school, taught to kids, taught by health teachers. And it's changed over time because it turns out there isn't evidence supporting the original food pyramid, so they call it a food plate, but they still advocate, you know, three kinds of diet: Mediterranean, DASH, and I've forgotten the third, but they're all high carb diets. And critics say, you know, for healthy Americans, sure, and Canadians, you can eat more widely. You know, if you're healthy, great. But for people that are overweight, for people with chronic conditions, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, aches and pains even, it's often inflammation. So you've got inflammation, and a big part of that is insulin resistance. So obesity, insulin resistance, and inflammation are this triangle that Dr. David Harper talks about as the core of these chronic conditions. And the doctor does not say, change what you eat, exercise some more, let's say. No, they say, well, here's a medication. You know, here's metformin for your diabetes, or here's something to lower your blood glucose, or here's, you know, pain medication for your inflammation. So, you know, our theme has been normal nutrition, just eat what people ate before this intervention, which was more healthy fat in the diet. You cooked with butter, you had whole fat cream, and, you know, other, and avocados, of course, we add to the diet as a vegetable fat. You can get your fats from vegetables as well as meat. But to reduce the carbohydrates and some of the hyper palatable foods, the pizzas that are combining carbohydrate and sugar, those things are hard for our body to resist.
Right, right. And I also want to get back a little bit of a comment that you made before that you were indirectly saying that people who are battling overweight should go on a low carb diet, but for me, this is more like I thought that we're not providing here the medical advice, right? Since we're not doctors here, so right. I was just a little bit shocked about that sentence.
Right. So every report should be prefaced, this isn't medical advice. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm advice from a friend or a scold. What do we call a scold? Someone who each time they meet you, they make a comment on something you could do better. So I'm not necessarily popular that way, but the advice is, you know, get your blood tested. You know, if it matters, measure it. So if you may have someone may have insulin resistance that is causing, let's say, weight problems, get it measured. And, you know, a continuous glucose monitor does this. That way you can measure, you know, when you eat this particular food, your blood glucose skyrockets. They do tests with couples. You know, the husband eats this, he's fine. The wife eats it, her blood glucose shoots up like a rocket. So they are, because of their microbiome or their internal biochemistry, they react differently to food. So people should measure themselves, find out. So you can do this with a blood test, a fasting glucose test that measures your blood glucose levels. And mine were like too high in 2019, although I didn't notice it at the time. I've got the test to look at now. So I was pre-diabetic before I started reading about these things. And I changed my diet, not on any medical advice. The doctors continue to disagree. You've got to have glucose, they say. You've got to eat carbs. But I changed my advice because I'm listening to other doctors, and they're cautioning that they're not giving medical advice to me. But my diet just changed as I learned more. So for everyday people listening, check your blood tests. You probably already have them. You can log into LabCorp and look at them, or you can look at the copy you may have got from your doctor. See what your hemoglobin A1C is. That's a 90-day record of your blood glucose levels. And if they're elevated, you potentially have a problem. So just check those things. And if you don't have blood tests or you're waiting, just reduce your carbs. You go 3 days, people with sugar cravings, 3 days, you can reset your sugar cravings. Now, and you could put it this way, not that you have to suffer for 3 days without sugar, but the benefit is sweets will taste better. Chocolate can taste fantastic, dark chocolate, except if you're used to a ton of sugar, dark chocolate tastes not as good. But in 3 days, it'll taste better. So you can reset your carb cravings, sugar cravings, just with 3 days for sugar, 14 days for carbs. Lots of books talk about this. So you don't have to do anything extreme. Just reduce carbs and see what happens. Or cut out bread. You may be allergic to bread or milk. You elimination diet, you pull a few things away and see how you feel.
Exactly. And what we always talked about, limit your quantity. And here I have a small tip for those who have a sweet tooth. I personally don't, but I do eat as a snack every day 2 ounces of dark chocolate, just because of the iron, and the banana, just because I'm looking into get more selenium and more tryptophans, which is really good with managing stress. So I really advise for the listener to put a small banana and some small bites of dark chocolate. You don't have to go 100% as I go with dark chocolate, but you can definitely go 75, 70. After 70, it's actually pretty good, and a bit of cinnamon, and that will taste amazing, believe me.
Yeah, and there's so many interesting things on this. The point is, we want to have an intuitive method of eating. You eat till you're full. You don't pull away from the table before you're full. You don't starve yourself unless you're, maybe fasting for religious reasons or things like that. So this intuitive eating means you eat till you're full. And it turns out if you eat an egg, you're full. A hard-boiled egg is really, to me, tastes great, and it's protein and fat. And for decades, the federal government said, don't eat an egg, essentially. Or they, all these Weight Watcher things, not Weight Watcher, the brand, but efforts to control weight would say, eat egg whites, but not the yolk. The yolk's got too much saturated fat. Well, that's not backed by evidence. So if you go to the CDC or WebMD or other sites, they define different, these are macronutrients. So the lipid or fat, carbohydrate, protein, those are the macronutrients in our diet. And the question is, how much carbohydrate should we have in a diet? How much fat? How much protein? So there are high protein diets that say put a lot of protein in there for weightlifters, because that's what's building muscle and body as the amino acids are used. But a low carb diet is really, you could say, is just less than what the government guidelines are. For example, the US dietary guidelines say 45 to 65% of your calories should come from carbohydrates. That's what the federal government US says, and I believe the same as Canada. Now, if you're healthy, and let's say you're out running and exercising, carbohydrates are turns to glucose in your bloodstream, goes into your muscles for energy, you burn it. And for healthy people, that can be fine. But a lot of people aren't healthy. A lot of people are overweight. A lot of people have insulin resistance and huge diabetes. And virtually all the researchers that I read say it's crazy to advise diabetics to have a lot of carbohydrates. And that's the status quo is you tell diabetics, even type 1 diabetics, go ahead and have carbohydrates, just cover it with insulin. That is to say, your blood glucose is going to shoot up. People are insulin resistant, so they inject themselves with insulin to bring down the blood glucose levels. But, critics of that say, no, don't do that. Just eat less carbohydrates. So the question is, how low can you go and still be healthy? So a low carb diet, again, which Nina Teicholz says is just the everyday diet that people used to have, would be that your carbohydrates, are below 45% or 40%. There's very low carbohydrates. They're down below 30% or 20%. There's keto diets. They're down to 5% carbohydrates, and the rest from fat, lipids, and protein. So there's disagreement over which of these are best, right? The paleo people say eat like people in the Paleolithic era, which we try to find out about by examining sites where those people lived. And it's, chasing animals and eating meat, on nose to tail, eating the whole animal, and then eating some above ground vegetables and things like that, or berries and nuts that you gather. But again, in the debate, I'd look this up, and just, there are people advocating keto, very low carb, carnivore, paleo, and it's worth looking at and seeing, you may find a friend who's doing that. You may learn about what it feels like and the health benefits, but there's plenty of people who criticize that. So
right.
It's a long talk without exactly answering your question. But I would say if a current person is eating 60% of their nutrients from carbs, if you drop that to 40%, that's not radical. The bigger question is the fat. Is it healthy to eat butter or eggs or whole fat dairy? We used to have 2% milk. My mom drank skim milk in her coffee because she thought that was best for her. Now I buy a half gallon of half and half, and I use that, not a ton, but I use that for a latte or whatever. That's a lot more fat. Is that dangerous? Well, people have to do your research. In the paper, I link to lots of studies, academics, research paper, peer-reviewed research paper. And there's a couple more things on research, because the governments, mainly in the US, has been so adamantly invested in promoting low fat. They've done huge studies, like with tens, hundreds of thousands of people, putting them on a low fat diet to see the health benefits. And basically they find higher mortality rates. More people died on a low fat diet, died of cancer and other things. No effect on heart disease. So the theory that they tried to test didn't confirm. So they doubled down and did more studies, and they've backed off. They don't use low fat in the guidelines anymore. They took that language out, but they advocate diets that are low fat. U.S. News and World Report has a report on the worst and best diets, and low fat keto are always at the bottom. Low carb and keto are always at the bottom of the list as the worst possible diets. So this is still taught in nutrition schools. It's still taught in public school by health teachers. Food pyramid, I shared with you the Canadian Diabetes Association.
Yeah.
Doesn't say anything about reducing carbohydrates for people who are diabetic. And that would be crazy according to the research. But the argument is these institutions are captured by interest groups. I mean, it sounds crazy, captured by big carb, the giant pasta companies. No, but it's just people are set in their ways. They've given this advice and they're not going to change. They're going to die first, apparently.
Yeah, it's hard to change people's mentality, but I guess by education and research, as you mentioned previously, that's the first step to start the journey.